Hi, I'm J.R. Hun. I also use the name J.R. Fibonacci when publishing sometimes. This piece is willing to prosper always. I call it willing to prosper always because willingness really does come first. Prospering always is the effect, and willingness is the root cause. And I will speak about some of the mechanics here in a moment. I could begin with thanking you for taking a few minutes to be willing to learn something new, or to be willing to learn a new way of interpreting or organizing information that may already be familiar to you, and thereby being willing to do what it takes to always prosper. And by always prosper, I mean prosper even as circumstances change and develop and emerge over time and shift. There will be different methods that will allow for prospering in different circumstances. So prospering always means adapting occasionally or even frequently, sometimes quickly adapting. And in order to quickly adapt, which leads to prospering always, willingness is relevant. So as a point of background, March 3rd, 2003, I published my first investment market analysis, in which I noticed a development in a certain lending market. And I noticed that development was correlated to certain sequence of events in the past. And so I forecast a decline in the borrowing and lending activity of people worldwide, particularly in the U.S. That's also known as a credit crisis or credit crunch, when borrowing and lending diminishes. In 2004 and 2005, I published some explanations of why that happened. In 2003, I did not know why, or not nearly as fully as I have come to learn. So here's a little background on the principles. Willingness leads to looking ahead diligently. And looking ahead allows for noticing early as things change and develop and emerge. We notice, because we're willing and looking ahead, we notice early what's emerging, what's developing. We also may notice what adaptations are relevant, what methods would be profitable, what methods would be safest, and so on, given what we notice emerging. So willing to prosper, we look ahead. And looking ahead, we notice early. And noticing early, we adjust and adapt quickly and precisely. And by adapting to circumstances quickly and in harmony and partnership with changing circumstances, we prosper consistently throughout all sorts of circumstances. Always. Not regardless of circumstances, but because of changing circumstances. Each change is an opportunity for prospering, if we're willing. So now a little bit more on what I noticed actually in 2002 that I published commentary about in early 2003. There was a shift in the willingness of people, including institutions and businesses, to lend money to the U.S. Treasury. There had been a certain pattern of lending in regard to how much willingness there was to lend for long periods of time and how much willingness there was to lend for short periods of time. Like long periods of time would be 10-year contracts or 30-year contracts, in which the U.S. Treasury had a long time to repay. And short term would be 3-month contracts or 2-year contracts, in which the U.S. Treasury promised to repay in a short amount of time. Of course, shorter terms are seen as safer from the perspective of the lender. In other words, people who buy U.S. government bonds, when they do long-term buying of bonds, that reflects different values and different interests than when people are more inclined to do short-term lending to the U.S. Treasury. So part of why there was a change was demographics, or the baby boom. From 1945 to 1965, there were a lot of births, a lot of population expansion in the U.S. and in parts of Europe and certain other parts of the world. There have been big advances in technology, big advances in access to energy, big advances in agriculture, and also young men had been away at war during World War II, and when they came home, they started families or continued the families they'd already started. They had more children. So there was a big surge from the war years to the return of those soldiers. There was a big surge in procreation and births and population. So those folks born around, let's say, 1945, 1946, well, guess what? It's 2010 now. It's been 65 or so years. They're coming to retirement age. So there have been relatively few people retiring in the last few years. Now, quite a few more people retiring. Also, the most spending tends to happen in the middle of people's lifetimes from the ages of 45 to 65. So once they pass that peak in the 40s and the 50s and start to get to their 60s, people tend to earn less, borrow less, spend less, and they're putting less money into retirement savings, and they're starting to sell those stocks and retirement funds and pension funds. There's money's coming out of them. Instead of money going into it, now money's coming out. That's what happens when people retire. People have less income when they retire, obviously, and that means they have less creditworthiness. They tend to borrow less. They tend to invest less in real estate. Instead of having 3 homes that are big, they go from their 3,000 square foot home down to a 1,500 square foot home, for instance, because they don't have kids at home anymore, and they maybe want to spend their money in other ways than lots of homes and having to deal with all the issues of owning a home. Maybe they move into a nursing home eventually, of course, but that's getting ahead. Maybe they just don't want to spend the time on housekeeping and house maintenance and roof repairs and all that stuff. They just want a simpler, smaller home. That's predictable as people retire. So that's what's been going on, and that's easy, and that's simple, and it's not especially scary. I present it first because the next thing might be somewhat scary. It's not really much more complicated, if any. It's quite simple. I already made reference to it. Energy. In the last few hundred years, there's been a huge increase in the energy consumption by humans, leading to things like global warming, I assert. Coal was really the first big fossil fuel, and then oil and natural gas. As all this energy was discovered, activity followed. Like the energy, not just muscle labor of horses and humans, but now we had machines, automobiles, steam engines, or uh, you know, railroads and steamboats, airplanes, trucks. Tremendous amount of energy. Also used for things like manufacturing and agriculture. So with all this extra production of food and all this extra buildings and so forth, we had a whole lot more people on this planet in the last few hundred years than several hundred years ago. Huge increase in population. All following right along with humans accessing fossil fuels and the energy that goes with those fossil fuels. So energy leads to activity, like economic activity, like production, like agriculture, like transportation, like communication, like electricity, like lights. Energy is the beginning of that whole sequence. So discovery of these fossil fuel reserves peaked several decades ago. Production, or extraction and refinement of fossil fuels, peaked in the U.S. in 1970, or production of oil peaked in 1970. Production of oil worldwide apparently peaked in 2006. And that means that consumption will be going down year after year and decade after decade worldwide in regard to oil and perhaps all other fossil fuels. If not immediately in regard to natural gas and coal, then soon. So with a decrease in energy means a decrease in activity, a decrease in manufacturing, a decrease in agriculture, a decrease in human populations, predictably. Unless there are huge increases in energy efficiency, it's predictable that there would be decreases in human population, at least in certain places. And again, we can see that has already happened in some cases. And when businesses aren't expecting economic growth to keep getting bigger and bigger, then they get a little bit more conservative in regard to long-term lending and borrowing. Individuals as well, right? We get more conservative lending 30-year contracts to Ireland or Greece or California or AIG or Merrill Lynch or Bank of America. If we have the perception that those operations, whether they're businesses or governments or whatever, if we have a sense that those operations are destabilizing or getting increasingly risky, then we're going to be less inclined to give them 10 years to repay or 30 years to repay. We don't want to, let them buy a building from us and take 30 years to repay. We want them to repay in 2 years, or how about 3 months? We'll give them short-term loans, but not so much long-term loans, right? So that's part of what's shifted, is businesses lending to other businesses, banks lending to individuals, individuals lending to governments, the whole array of things. There's been a huge shift in behavior, and it corresponds not, yes, to get demographics, but even more precisely, it corresponds to accessing fossil fuels. So we have in our midst a tremendous change, historic change, in regard to humanity. And adapting quickly to this decreasing access to fossil fuels certainly allows for prospering through those developments. Also points to the value of certain kinds of innovation, certain kinds of inefficiency in economy, and things like living in places where water is plentiful and where certain kinds of energy are plentiful, and where different places are going to be quite distinct in terms of how valuable they are. Small variations will make big differences, or can. I'll make one quick reference. In the Mayan civilization, they had great civil engineering for capturing water. For 3 years, though, the monsoon rains didn't come. Their agriculture obviously failed because they relied on captured rainwater for irrigation. Their population collapsed. They had been the biggest cities in the world in the Mayan culture, and then they were gone within a few years. If you are willing to notice things early, looking ahead, and then adapt quickly, you can prosper with me. I look forward to doing that with you. You can reach me through my blog, jrfibonacci.wordpress.com. Thank you for your interest and partnership.